Sammy Davis Jr.'s Vegas territory dispute ended when McQueen's gun spoke first in the underground gambling den that Hollywood's golden boy had built through blood money and broken kneecaps. The world knew Davis as the song and dance man who could charm audiences into forgetting their troubles, but in the neon-soaked basement beneath the Strip, he was something else entirely. A man whose smile hid the kind of business that left competitors floating face down in Lake Mead. When the King of Cool walked into territory that belonged to killers, what followed would prove that some entertainment legends earned their real reputation through methods that never made it onto variety show stages. The slot machine bells suddenly sounded like funeral chimes counting down to violence. If you want to witness the untold stories of Hollywood's most dangerous criminal enterprises, subscribe now. Las Vegas, Nevada. Beneath the glittering facade of the Strip, where the real business of sin was conducted in soundproofed basements that never appeared on tourist maps or casino floor plans. The underground gambling operation occupied territory that existed in shadows cast by legitimate entertainment, where different rules governed behavior and different currencies determined success according to standards that civilized people couldn't understand without becoming uncivilized themselves. The basement had been constructed using techniques borrowed from speakeasy architecture, with reinforced walls that prevented sound from traveling to legitimate businesses above, multiple escape routes that provided alternatives when law enforcement discovered locations that were supposed to remain invisible, and security measures that reflected understanding that this kind of business attracted violent people whose disputes were settled through methods that left permanent rather than temporary evidence. Thick cigarette smoke hung in the air like fog that obscured more than just vision, mixing with the scent of expensive liquor and something metallic that suggested recent violence had been conducted in spaces where blood could be cleaned up quickly, without leaving stains that might attract unwanted attention from authorities whose cooperation was purchased rather than assumed. The clientele represented Las Vegas's shadow economy, high-stakes gamblers whose losses were measured in human rather than monetary currency, organized crime figures whose entertainment preferences required privacy that legitimate casinos couldn't provide, and celebrities whose public personas depended on maintaining separation between their wholesome images and recreational activities that would destroy careers if documented by photographers or journalists. Sammy Davis Jr., 44 years old, moved through his underground kingdom like a monarch whose authority was backed by methods that his entertainment career couldn't reveal, without destroying the carefully constructed public image that had made him wealthy and famous. The song and dance performances that audiences loved represented only one source of income for someone whose business interests extended into territories where talent mattered less than willingness to enforce territorial boundaries through violence. Fresh from another successful engagement that had proven his ability to charm audiences who would be horrified to learn about his secondary business activities, Davis understood that his entertainment career provided perfect cover for operations that generated more revenue than legitimate performance could produce through ticket sales and recording contracts that were subject to taxation and industry regulation that reduced profitability. His compact frame carried authority that had nothing to do with stage presence and everything to do with reputation for settling business disputes through methods that eliminated future disagreements permanently rather than temporarily. Those famous eyes had witnessed more than entertainment history. They had observed negotiations where failure to reach acceptable terms resulted in consequences that couldn't be appealed or reversed through legal channels. Tonight, Davis was conducting business that required personal attention rather than delegation to subordinates who might lack authority necessary for convincing reluctant customers that cooperation was preferable to alternatives that involved physical persuasion applied until agreement was reached through methods that formal negotiation couldn't achieve. The underground gambling operation represented expansion into territory that other organizations considered their exclusive domain, requiring diplomatic resolution or competitive elimination of rivals whose claims might interfere with profitable activities that Davis had invested considerable resources to establish according to business models that prioritized results over methods used to achieve them. Steve McQueen, 40 years old, entered the basement through entrance that looked like maintenance access to people who weren't familiar with Las Vegas's hidden architecture, where legitimate businesses provided convenient camouflage for activities that generated revenue through methods that conventional commerce couldn't employ without attracting legal attention that would destroy profitable enterprises. His presence in Davis's underground operation wasn't recreational or accidental. Intelligence gathered through entertainment industry networks had suggested that high-stakes gambling was being conducted according to rules that eliminated player advantages through methods that transformed games of chance into systematic wealth transfer from customers to house operators who understood that consistent profits required controlling variables that legitimate casinos couldn't manipulate. Fresh from discovering that several colleagues had lost substantial sums through gambling activities that appeared to be legitimate entertainment but were actually sophisticated extraction operations designed to separate wealthy celebrities from liquid assets through psychological manipulation that made victims grateful for losses that would be considered theft under different circumstances. McQueen's pale blue eyes surveyed the basement environment with tactical awareness that suggested he was measuring everything according to lessons learned in places where survival depended on recognizing threats before they became immediate, rather than potential dangers that could be avoided through careful assessment of situations that might require decisive action rather than diplomatic resolution. His leather jacket concealed equipment that reflected understanding that business discussions in underground gambling operations might require more than verbal persuasion to reach conclusions that satisfied all parties whose interests were represented through methods that formal negotiation couldn't adequately address when those interests conflicted in ways that threatened profitable activities. The confrontation developed naturally as Davis recognized that McQueen's presence represented potential threat to operations that had been carefully constructed to avoid attention from law enforcement, entertainment industry oversight, or competitors whose business interests might be damaged by successful gambling enterprises that operated according to rules that legitimate establishments couldn't employ. "Steve McQueen," Davis announced, his voice carrying authority that filled the basement despite competition from slot machine sounds and conversation that provided acoustic camouflage for discussions that required privacy from surveillance methods that might be employed by people whose interests were threatened by successful criminal enterprises. "Sammy," McQueen replied, acknowledging Davis's legendary entertainment status while maintaining composure that suggested he wasn't intimidated by circumstances that would terrify most civilians who discovered they were surrounded by people whose business activities included violence as standard operating procedure rather than exceptional response to unusual situations. "Interesting choice of venue for evening entertainment. Though I understand your recreational preferences have evolved beyond what most people would consider standard celebrity activities that serve relaxation rather than profit generation, through methods that require customer ignorance about actual odds being offered." The observation was delivered with casual tone that made it clear McQueen understood the nature of Davis's business operations while simultaneously challenging their legitimacy according to standards that might not apply in environments where different rules governed acceptable behavior and different authorities determined what constituted legal rather than criminal activity. Everyone needs hobbies that provide stimulation beyond what legitimate entertainment can offer to people whose success has eliminated most sources of genuine excitement that serve psychological requirements for risk-taking that can't be satisfied through conventional activities. Davis replied, his response revealing nothing about whether he interpreted McQueen's comment as casual observation or direct challenge to business practices that might not survive scrutiny from people whose approval wasn't necessary for continued operations. "Hobbies," McQueen repeated, moving closer to gambling tables where activities were being conducted according to rules that eliminated player advantages through methods that transformed recreation into systematic wealth extraction from customers whose losses generated profits that couldn't be achieved through legitimate entertainment alone. Is that what you call operations designed to separate wealthy celebrities from liquid assets through psychological manipulation that makes victims grateful for theft that would be prosecuted under different circumstances if it were conducted through methods that didn't provide plausible deniability about criminal intent? The challenge was direct and unambiguous, forcing Davis to respond to accusations that his gambling operation was criminal enterprise rather than legitimate entertainment business, that his customers were victims rather than willing participants, and that his profits were generated through theft rather than honest commerce that provided fair value for money exchanged. That's a serious accusation to make in territory where such accusations might be considered threats to business operations that employ people whose job security depends on maintaining profitable activities that serve customer demand for entertainment that legitimate establishments can't provide due to regulatory restrictions that limit recreational options. Davis's response carried implications that McQueen understood immediately. The basement was controlled territory where different rules applied, where accusations about criminal activity might be considered hostile acts that required defensive responses through methods that eliminated sources of potential interference with profitable operations that generated revenue for multiple people whose livelihoods depended on continued success. Territory, McQueen said, understanding that Davis was attempting to establish psychological dominance through appeals to territorial authority that might intimidate visitors who weren't prepared for confrontations that exceeded verbal disagreement to reach physical territory, where superior numbers and home field advantage determined outcomes according to standards that civilized people couldn't survive without adopting uncivilized methods. You think controlling basement real estate gives you authority over people who object to criminal activities that damage entertainment industry colleagues through systematic theft disguised as legitimate gambling that provides fair opportunities for winning rather than guaranteed losses designed to transfer wealth from customers to operators. I think controlling territory gives me authority over what happens in that territory to people who enter it voluntarily and participate in activities according to rules that are clearly explained before money changes hands through transactions that customers approve through actions, rather than words that might be interpreted differently by people who weren't present during negotiations. The territorial claim was comprehensive and backed by presence of associates whose business responsibilities included enforcement of Davis's authority through methods that didn't require extensive discussion or appeal processes that might delay resolution of disputes that threatened profitable operations or challenged established hierarchies that maintained order through predictable consequences for unacceptable behavior. McQueen understood that he was outnumbered by people whose loyalty to Davis was based on financial rather than personal considerations, that escape routes were controlled by associates whose job security depended on preventing unwanted departures that might compromise operational security, and that his survival might depend on actions that exceeded diplomatic negotiation to reach territory where different skills determined outcomes. Sammy, I didn't come here to threaten your business operations or challenge your territorial authority over basement gambling activities that generate revenue through methods that might be questionable but aren't necessarily illegal according to standards that apply in jurisdictions where local authorities have been convinced that such activities serve community interests. Then why did you come here? To inform you that colleagues who've lost substantial sums through your gambling operations are beginning to ask questions about odds, house advantages, and statistical probabilities that suggest systematic manipulation rather than random chance determining outcomes that consistently favor house operators over customers who should occasionally experience winning streaks if games were conducted according to legitimate probability distributions. The warning was delivered with professional courtesy that acknowledged Davis's authority while simultaneously indicating that external pressure was building toward levels that might require defensive responses from people whose business interests were threatened by gambling operations that generated profits through methods that couldn't survive scrutiny from investigators whose authority exceeded local cooperation that had protected such activities from interference. Questions from whom? Studio executives whose financial interests are damaged when valuable actors lose liquid assets that affect their ability to maintain lifestyles that support career activities, insurance companies whose policies cover celebrities whose gambling losses might indicate risk assessment problems that affect coverage decisions, and federal agencies whose interest in organized gambling extends beyond local jurisdictions that might have cooperative arrangements with business operators. The implications were clear. Davis's gambling operation was attracting attention from authorities whose cooperation couldn't be purchased through methods that had proven effective with local law enforcement, that his business model was generating scrutiny that might threaten not only gambling activities but entertainment career that provided essential cover for criminal enterprises that couldn't survive exposure to federal investigation. Davis understood that McQueen was offering warning rather than making threat, that external pressures were building beyond levels that could be controlled through local influence, and that continued operations might require modifications that reduced visibility while maintaining profitability through methods that serve customer demand without attracting unwanted attention from authorities whose jurisdiction exceeded local arrangements. And you're suggesting what kind of modifications to business practices that have proven successful over extended period without generating problems that couldn't be resolved through established channels that provide protection from interference that might otherwise disrupt profitable activities. I'm suggesting that systematic customer losses should be balanced with occasional wins that maintain illusion of fair gambling rather than guaranteed wealth transfer that generates suspicion about manipulation. That celebrity customers should be protected from losses that exceed their ability to maintain public personas that benefit everyone involved in entertainment industry activities, and that territorial disputes with competitors should be resolved through business arrangements rather than violence that attracts law enforcement attention. The suggestions represent a diplomatic solution that acknowledged Davis's authority while protecting entertainment industry colleagues from systematic exploitation, that maintained profitable gambling operations while reducing visibility that might attract unwanted attention, and that resolved territorial conflicts through negotiation rather than violence that could escalate beyond manageable levels. Reasonable suggestions. Davis acknowledged, understanding that McQueen was offering face-saving compromise that preserved essential business interests, while addressing external pressures that threatened both gambling operations and entertainment career, that provided necessary cover for activities that generated most of his actual revenue through methods that couldn't be conducted openly. Though implementation might require adjustments to operational procedures that have proven effective for maintaining customer satisfaction while generating profits that justify investment in facilities, equipment, and personnel that serve specialized entertainment requirements. Adjustments that could be implemented gradually without disrupting established customer relationships or alerting competitors to changes that might affect territorial arrangements. McQueen replied, understanding that Davis needed time to modify operations while maintaining face with associates whose respect was based on perception that his authority couldn't be challenged by outsiders whose interests conflicted with profitable activities. The basement returned to normal operations as underground gambling establishment that served customer demand for high-stakes entertainment that legitimate casinos couldn't provide due to regulatory restrictions. Having witnessed diplomatic resolution of territorial dispute that could have escalated into violence that would have damaged everyone's interests while serving no productive purposes. Years later, when federal investigations revealed extensive organized crime involvement in Las Vegas entertainment industry, Davis's gambling operations would be noted as example of criminal enterprises that had been modified to avoid prosecution through business arrangements that reduced visibility while maintaining profitability. Subscribe for more untold stories of Hollywood's most dangerous territorial negotiations that prevented industry wars.